Welcome to you all. I am Fred Schauer, Acting Director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. The center is the sponsor of the annual Theodore White Lecture on Press and Politics. This lecture series honors Theodore H. White, who lived from 1915 to 1986, was a summa cum laude graduate of the Harvard College class of 1938, then began a long and distinguished career as a foreign correspondent for Time magazine and numerous other journals and news agencies. His importance now, however, is largely because of a series of path-breaking books on elections and on American politics, most prominently The Making of the President 1960, and also The Making of the President 1964, The Making of the President 1968, The Making of the President 1972, and The Making of the President 1980. I didn't miss one. As well as Breach of Faith, The Fall of Richard Nixon, and a quite remarkable autobiography, In Search of History, A Personal Adventure. During his lifetime, White's work was appropriately celebrated, but there were two occasional criticisms, which I mention now because neither of them have stood the test of time. One was the occasional question about objectivity, because some thought, for example, that White may have been less kindly towards, for example, Richard Nixon than to, for example, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But in ways that are only now being recognized, objectivity does not mean numerical equality. Objectivity does not mean exact balance in a numerical sense. That White, for example, thought that the good parts of the Kennedy campaign and presidency, Camelot, he called it in a still memorable term, were more particularly important, is a judgment that has been vindicated by history. The other criticism, that White was more a celebrant at times than a critic of the American political and electoral tradition, is a criticism that is not only becoming less valid as time goes by, but a voice that many people are increasingly seeking. That White saw the good in political life where others looked for flaws. That White saw the beauty of the system as much as its pitfalls. That White saw people's accomplishments as being as important as their missteps, is a voice resonant with much of contemporary criticism of what some people think is an overly cynical and overly negative contemporary style of political reporting. We are pleased that this year's Theodore H. White lecturer is Cokie Roberts. Before I introduce her at some greater length than just her name, let me mention that after her lecture, Marvin Kalb, the regular, not acting director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy, will moderate a question and answer session. And tomorrow morning in the Malkin penthouse of this building, there will be a seminar devoted to critique, analysis, and commentary on tonight's lecture, featuring a cast of people quite important in their own right, Derek Bach, Kathleen Hall-Jamieson, Tom Rosenstiel, the aforementioned Marvin Kalb, and Buddy Roemer, all of whom have Harvard connections, all of whom are people situated either within the press or within politics or within policymaking, or within all three, and we are looking forward to a quite informative, lively seminar tomorrow morning. But now to the business at hand, which is Cokie Roberts. A graduate of Wellesley College, Roberts is one of the country's most distinguished political reporters and commentators, specializing on Congress and public policy. Although we think of her as a broadcast journalist, she has been prominent as well in the print press. She's written important op-ed columns for the New York Times and the Washington Post, articles for the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, and many others. Still, her greatest prominence is in broadcast journalism. She has been a contributor to PBS's MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour and her coverage of the Iran-Contra investigations for that program earned her the Weintal Award in 1987. She has also been a reporter for CBS News, for WRC-TV in Washington, and she now serves both as a correspondent for ABC News and a news analyst for National Public Radio. She's received the Edward R. Murrow Award in Public Radio, was the first broadcast journalist to win the Everett McKinley Dirksen Award for coverage of Congress, and is a former president of the Radio and Television Correspondents Association. Tonight, the Theodore H. White Lecture on Press and Public Policy to speak on politics and the press, clashing cultures. I give you Cokie Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Please stop. Thank you. I actually don't have a legitimate Harvard connection. I spent a great deal of my undergraduate days across the street in Eliot House, however. It is exactly 12.5 miles, by the way, from the entrance of Eliot House to Tower Court. And mirabile dicte, I am married to the guy I was seeing in Eliot House a mere 32 years ago. So it does sort of rub off whether you want it to or not. Of course, it was in the era, you students will just not know what I'm talking about, but it was in the era of parietal hours. And you had to be out of Eliot House at midnight, and you didn't have to be in Wellesley till 2. It was really cold. That's all I'll say about that. I am obviously extremely honored to be giving the Theodore H. White Lecture. I only met Mr. White once, and that was at the Wayfarer Bar, of course, in New Hampshire in the 1980 campaign. I find that I date my life by campaigns, which is probably not a good way to do it, but it is the way I remember things. Unfortunately, each of my children was born during a campaign, so I can remember them. But the 80 campaign, I remember all of us paying homage to Mr. White at the bar and learning, even briefly, a great deal from him. I must say, though, in my own personal experience, I'm even more honored to be speaking at the school named after my very good friend, Joe Marone, who I knew well and intimately and loved dearly. So it is a wonderful thing for me to be able to do something in her honor as well. I'm also very honored by my predecessors in this lecture, Walter Cronkite, Ben Bradley, Warren Rudman, Dan Shore, my good friend. I think of him mainly as the husband of Lee Shore, but hey. It clearly was time for a skirt. And I am delighted that you chose my skirt. I hear often, by the way, from older women who are the people I most want to please because they have the wisdom. Dear, you're the only person who covers her knees on the air, so very aware of my skirts. But my assignment, and it was, I got a Harvard assignment for tonight from Marvin, was Politics in the Press, Clashing Cultures. And I giggled when he assigned me this, because I remember one of my, of course, very earliest memories about the press. My father was running for governor of Louisiana, buddy, and the year was 1951. The election was in January of 52, so it was basically 1951 election. It was, in many ways, one of the more remarkable experiences that anyone should ever have. I'll just tell you a brief vignette from it, which will give you a sense of my growing up years. It was, of course, the height of McCarthyism. There were 9 candidates in the field because Earl Long could not succeed himself as governor. And one of them accused my father of being a communist, and a communist could not run for governor of Louisiana. There were rules. And so he had to go to court and prove he wasn't a communist and all that. And meanwhile, Earl Long was stumping the northern part of the state, the real Baptist part of the state, and saying, you know what they're saying down there in southern Louisiana, which is, sin and iniquity, just by its definition. They're saying that Hale Boggs is a communist. Now, you know that can't be true. Hale Boggs is a good Catholic boy. Much worse. And you know what they're saying down there in the big city of New Orleans? Horrible. They're saying that if Hale Boggs is elected, the Pope of Rome himself is going to come here and rule Louisiana. Now you know that's not true. The Pope is a very busy man. But the Archbishop of New Orleans, and it was a great campaign. But, and he lost. He came in third in a field of 9. And of course, this was in an era where there were only Democrats in Louisiana, at least nominally. And there was a second primary. And the election, the counting had gone on late at night. And my parents had gotten in, I guess, around 3 or 4 in the morning. So I was 7 throughout the course. I guess by the time the actual election came, I just turned 8, 2 weeks before. My sister, therefore, was 12. And a reporter for the afternoon newspaper called and asked to speak to my father. And she said, well, I'm not going to, he's asleep. He hasn't been to bed all night. I'm not going to wake him up. And the reporter said, well, what does he think about the election? And she said, well, he knows he lost. And then, being a very smart 12-year-old, she said, but I am only 12 years old. She said, who is this? And he told her. And she said, I am only 12 years old. You can't quote me. And that afternoon, the newspaper came out with a banner headline, source close to Hale Boggs concedes election. Clashing cultures, I'd say so. Was I raised with a certain sense of at least healthy skepticism about the press? Totally. Was there a sense that I was going over to the other side when I, somewhere along the line, chose this trade? Certainly. The only thing that kept my parents from being totally devastated was the fact that they had both been journalists themselves in their dear dead youths. They met on the Tulane Hullabaloo, where my father was editor-in-chief, my mother was Newcomb editor, the highest position a woman could achieve, and Howard K. Smith was the sports editor. So it was something that they at least had a passing acquaintance with, and actually my father, I'm told, really tried to go into journalism, and the editor of the Times-Picayune, at that point it was just the Picayune, I guess, said to him that he wouldn't keep him on. He worked at the paper all through college, and the editor said he wouldn't keep him on if he didn't go to law school, because he knew that it was a better deal, even then. So it was with some sense of understanding, if disappointment, that they discovered that this is what I was going to do when I grew up. So the answer to the question that Marvin posed, politics and press clashing cultures, is yes, certainly, absolutely. Let me tell you a conversation that just happened the day after this recent election between politician mother and journalist daughter. Daughter to mother, you sound awful, what's wrong? Mother to daughter, the country has just gone to the dogs. Daughter to mother, it is a great story. You can probably guess who the players in this little drama were. And I think it perfectly reveals the fundamental reason for the clash of cultures. Now, Marvin has also insisted that I write out this speech. I've never done this before in my life, and I'm not at all sure I can see it. But, I mean, he waited long enough in my life so I can't see anymore. But I will keep to it as much as I can. I do think that, that the cultures bang up against each other because our interests are different. They just are. And I don't want to be grandiose about it, but our missions are different. It makes politicians absolutely furious when they've spent a day on the floor of Congress passionately defending some issue, and they care deeply about it. And all we want to know is, will they finish the debate in time for us to make our deadlines, or better yet, dinner. And I've often said, we do have, they're right, the press is biased. We're in favor of dinner. But they, of course, see our lack of concern as a proof of our cynicism, and we see it as evidence of our objectivity, that we are not concerned with the issues that they're concerned about. When they're honest, they'll admit they often dislike us because they want to shoot the messenger. It's an age-old desire, and it's understandable. We are the people who bring the bad news that they don't want to hear. That certainly happened past week in Washington. It was our fault that the Republicans took the House. They also will admit, when they are frank, that they want the media around when it's to their advantage, and when it's to their disadvantage, they would prefer for us to just simply disappear. They can't do the deal. It's very interesting. A lot of what they hate about us is simply that we're there, that we have turned on the light, that we are sitting in the room. And it makes it much harder to do the deal, much harder to say what you really think, much harder to get things done just because we're there. Some of you probably remember the wonderful story that our old friend Charlie Moore from the New York Times used to tell during the 1964 campaign, where he would go to cover a Goldwater rally or speech and say, and invariably there'd be some Goldwater supporter there who would rush up to the staff and say, stop them, they're writing down every word he's saying. And there was some sense of that. There's also a question of perspective. I did read over the past White lectures to prepare for this one, and I was struck by something in Marvin's introduction to Ben Bradlee, where he quoted from Bradlee's book, Conversations with Kennedy. President Kennedy said, quote, "What makes journalism so fascinating and biography so interesting is the struggle to answer the single question, what's he like?" Well, putting aside the question of how President Kennedy would feel about our attempts to answer that question about him right now, I think that politicians would often have one answer to that question, and journalists another. We have different standards by which we judge what's he like. And again, if politicians are honest, they will admit that there's only one thing they want us to say, which is, he's godlike. I would argue that their interest is a great deal more in hagiography than biography. There's also a question on this whole question of inevitability of the clash. There's the axiom, I learned this axiom from that great source book, the Freedom Forum Calendar, which we all get free in the mail every year. And I discovered on October 4th, you see I have been thinking about this lecture. On October 4th, it had a quotation from Reuben Frank, a longtime president of NBC News, who many of you know, where he said, quote, "The role of the press is to inform society about problems, not to solve them." That's true. But, and this is where I would like to differ from just simply pointing out that the cultures naturally clash. But it is also not our role to make problems worse. And that is what the politicians and the public today think we are doing. And that's caused the volume of the clash to rise considerably, well beyond that's caused by the inherent difference in our cultures. In its survey on the people, the press, and politics, the Times Mirror Center reports that when asked, quote, whether the media helps or hinders society in solving its problems, 71% said the news media gets in the way of solutions, while 25% said it helps. That response didn't surprise me. It's basically what I would have said. I think that this is the place where my view of being the child of politicians as well as a member of the press does come into play. They're looking at clouds from both sides now. I don't quite get it. I don't see the point of uncovering, revealing, now it can be telling some scandal or wrongdoing or never before told, if there's nothing anybody can do about it, if nobody trusts any institution in the society to fix the problem. And people in the media believe that, people in the public believe that we in the media are tearing down institutions because we are. When he delivered his lecture 2 years ago, this lecture, former Senator Warren Rubman quoted from one national magazine's description of Congress, quote, trading votes for money or pleasure is another day at the office, unquote. And another magazine, the notion that public service might require some sacrifice has become a quaint relic. Working in government instead has come to be seen as a way to enrich oneself, unquote. I've covered Congress for a very long time, much too long, and I don't recognize those descriptions. They do not bear any resemblance to the institution that I cover. And I would agree with Rubman's conclusion that, quote, our political system needs the trust of people to function properly, and if people believe that all of government is corrupt and for sale, our democracy will suffer. Well, right now, our political system does not have the trust of the people. In our exit polls that we took last week on Election Day, ABC News, in its questions, asked about trust in government. 3/4 of the people said they trust government to do the right thing only part of the time or not at all. 70% said they were either dissatisfied with or angry at the federal government. In the Times Mirror survey, a bare majority said government was run for the benefit of the people. A plurality said elected officials don't care what the voters think, and a majority said they believe they don't have a say in what government does. Now, I'm not here to argue that our problems can all be solved if people trust in government. There's a lot of distrust in government is based on personal experience. I always think, what is most of our intersection with government? The Motor Vehicle Administration, You could do that or hit yourself on the head with a 2x4 for fun and games activities in the course of a day. But there's a lot of reason to question the efficacy of government and to question whether any government, particularly the federal government, should be the institution to solve all of our problems. But there are times when it must, or at least must try. And I think that to succeed, the public has to have some sort of sense that our leaders have the best interest of the nation at heart. And that sense, that faith in leadership has basically disappeared. Polls show that a huge majority of voters believe elected officials quickly lose touch with the people. That's why before this election they said they wanted all new leaders, even when we asked them, even if they were ineffective. And of course the results of the election proved the polls right. They did vote for all new leaders. Now I think it's possible that you said that. I think it's possible that the Republican takeover of Congress can go a very long way to restoring faith in the institution. This is my great hope. If voters are serious about the other wish that they stated in the polling, to see federal politicians pay more attention to the nation than the neighborhood, then that might make Congress seem less craven than it does right now to the voters. The election, I think, could also stir some serious conversation instead of just bloviated speechifying about gimmicks like the line item veto, the balanced budget amendment, and term limits, all of which rest on the basic premise that our politicians have no judgment and can't be trusted. Now that the Republicans no longer see themselves as the permanent minority, they might even stop attacking the institution where they serve. We'll see. The responsibility for tearing down the institution, however, does not, and this is important to keep in mind, does not just rest with them. Democrats have done more than their share of Congress bashing, and neither party has taken steps to cure what voters legitimately hate about the Congress. They haven't done anything about the way campaigns are financed. They haven't done anything about the partisan, often childish bickering that characterizes much of the debate. And they haven't done anything about what I see as the biggest problem in the Congress, which is a failure of leadership on many crucial issues. So politicians, in my view, must shoulder a very heavy burden for the blame for lack of trust in the system. But so must we. It's not only that we distort, as in the examples that Senator Rudman put forward. It's that we fail to even try to tell much of the story, because it's hard. It's hard to deal with ideas. It's particularly hard in broadcasting. But it's hard to tell the whole story, and we take so much out of context. Look at the stories that have become a staple of broadcast news reports, all of the stories about government waste. These are completely accurate for the most part, well-documented, totally valid stories. But they leave the impression with viewers that if politicians would just cut out the dumb stuff, that everything would be all right. No one ever, ever, ever says the truth, which is that you could get rid of every program that every television news report or hard copy or radio report or newspaper or magazine has written about. Get rid of all of them. Get rid of the entire space program, the entire agriculture program, every federal court, prison, the FBI, the CIA. Pave over the Capitol or turn it into condominiums. You know, fire the Congress, send home their entire staff. Get rid of every single solitary program in the federal government, with the exception of defense, interest on the national debt, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and you still have a federal deficit. Do we ever talk about that when we talk about waste in government? No. And what's the effect of that? The effect is that we remove the responsibility from the voters. We pander as much as the politicians do. We don't ever say, look, if you really want to do something about this problem, you have to take a hit, not just the space station. And that's one of the reasons why I agree with the public view that the media hurts the nation's ability to solve its problems. Another is one that Fred referred to, which is the total unwillingness, one that he said that Teddy White was willing to do, but we have not been willing to do since then, which is to talk about accomplishments of anyone in government ever. Right before the election, Newsweek magazine conducted a true-false poll, which revealed that a substantial majority just plain had the facts wrong about questions as to whether the country is still in recession, whether the deficit has gone down since Bill Clinton's become president, and whether the crime bill spends more money on social programs than prisons. I can't find anyone other than the media to blame when people have the information wrong. When they're misinformed, it's our fault. We're the people who are supposed to be in the business of informing. It means we're simply not doing our jobs. And then, what about the basics, the truly underlying concept of an institution called Congress? You Latin scholars know it's coming together, a place of people of diverse regions and backgrounds, and in this country, incredibly diverse regions and backgrounds. I mean, you look at the United States of America, and it would be civil war. It was once here. In most places, with the kinds of differences economically and ethnically that we have in this country. Congress is the place where they are supposed to come together to mediate their differences and compromise. And how do we treat compromise? We treat it as a base sellout to special interest. The very basic notion of our representative government we treat as evil. All this negativism, I think, has now culminated, and I'm very curious about this, in a fundamental questioning of the whole concept of representative government. I think that many of you I know in the Shorenstein Center, and many of you in journalism have looked at the idea of what the phenomena of alternative sources of information are doing to our business. All of the call-in shows, the tabloids, the online computer business. This campaign, many candidates communicated with the voters online. I did it one night at ABC. It was the weirdest thing I've ever done in my life. I have to tell you, those people ask strange questions. But, no. Whew. And all of that. We've spent some time looking at how faxes, how they affect the mainstream media. But we haven't really spent enough time, in my view, talking about how they affect the body politic. On election day, in the polls on election day, 20% of the voters said they listened to talk radio, and they were the vanguard of the throw the bums out. They went Republican by a 2-to-1 margin. But here's my question. How likely are they to decide in 2 years that the Republican Congress has succeeded, when we will still be out there, as the nattering nabobs of negativism, giving the sense that every move they make is something to be criticized? My guess at that point is not that people turn back to the Democrats. I think at that point they start to say that these politicians simply aren't worth the trouble. As it is, we are seeing tremendous support, overwhelming support, in the 80 and 90% for referenda and initiatives. Now, the theory here is this is, direct democracy. My theory is it's direct money. One of my favorite stories about an initiative was in California years ago, where the city of Los Angeles decided to tax the country clubs at their use value. So there's golf courses at the Los Angeles Country Club and the Hillcrest Country Club, one Christian, one Jewish, were now going to be taxed at what they could get did they have high-rises built on them. And this was, and so the members of the country clubs decided to put an initiative on the ballot. This is a country club initiative. I mean, let's get this straight. All this did was protect 2 country clubs. They put ads on TV, keep California green. Vote for Proposition A. They won. And it is, to me, a classic example of just how much the folk really have a say in referenda and initiatives. But that is where the mood is. That's where it's going. And it, along with all of the proposals, as I say, to limit the terms and the power of representatives, all part of a mood that representative government is in some way venal, wrong. Any citizen can get information at the same time people in government do now, same time we in the mainstream press do. And it promotes a sense of, I know as much as those guys do. What do I need them for? That attitude, I think, is very much reinforced by the Ross Perot's of the world, talking about a national town meeting where the voters get to decide what government does. And it sounds so fair. Power to the people. Get rid of the elites. Talk about the tyranny of the majority. I mean, there it is, folks. I noticed in his lecture that Ben Bradley quoted the famous Bristol speech of Edmund Burke that we all learned as political science majors. Quote, "Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion." That could not be further from the public mood of today. I think a lot of voters would be much happier if they just sort of hooked up electrodes to their member of Congress and pushed the button, you know, and hadn't had him or her respond to the instant polls in their districts. This was never a good idea, but it has become, I think, a much worse idea in an era when it's very clear that the majorities are not feeling wildly sympathetic toward the minorities. Look at, again, this election we've just gone through and Proposition 187 in California, the view of the majority toward the minority immigrants. Not to mention, if any of your children, those of us who are older, suggest you move to Oregon, you might look at them again and decide about the will. You combine this with some recent Times Mirror data showing for the first time the majority of whites believe the country's gone too far in promoting equal rights for blacks. We never saw that before, but that's true now. And I think that what you see is a very dangerous road ahead if what we're headed for is direct democracy. And here's where I think we in the mainstream media need to conduct what the nuns who raised me would call an examination of conscience about our role in all of this, as well as the role of the alternative information sources and the role of the politicians. It seems to me that we have an obligation to do a better job. We need to do a better job of explaining the institutions of government, particularly the Congress, because I believe that without them, we have absolutely no defining principle as a nation. We have no nationhood. We have no common history. We have no shared ethnicity. We don't all worship in the same religion. We don't even speak the same language in this country. All we have defining us as a nation is our commitment to the Constitution and the institutions that it created, all of the institutions that it created. Without that, it seems to me, without that, I don't know what we are as a country, and to undermine those institutions, and I don't mean to be melodramatic about this, but I feel it very strongly, I think is a real recipe for disunion. And we're seeing it around the world, and it is an easy way to see it happening in this country. One of the political people that I was privileged and had the great fun of knowing as I was growing up in the world of politics was Tommy Corcoran, Tommy the Cork, a great brain truster in Franklin Roosevelt's day. But before he became famous as a brain truster, he was a clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes, that great Harvardian. And Tommy Corcoran used to love to tell the story that Oliver Wendell Holmes told, which was about the circus parade coming to town. And Holmes would say, you know, in a circus parade that would sort of announce the arrival of the circus, the elephants always went first. And the little boys in the town would dance in front of the elephants, pretending to be leading them. But of course, the elephants were going to march on regardless of the little boys. And Holmes said, those little boys were the politicians of any era. And the elephants were the great social movements of the time. They would march on regardless. And I've thought about that story, of course, over the years, because it was such a wonderful one. And I've thought about our role in the press in that parade. And I think that I see us as the people on the side, writing it down, but recording it. Those elephant noises would be good. But great pictures. But our role, it seems to me, is that we can either throw obstacles in the paths of those elephants and slow down the great social movements, or we can try to make smooth the path, get things out of the way. And I would say in this country, in this half century, for the great social movements, we've played both roles. I think we did make smooth the path for the civil rights movement. We enabled it in a lot of ways. And I think I in this case actually would say they, hampered the women's movement. But I do think that those are the two great movements we've seen in this part of this century, and the press has played different roles in each one. But then that brings me to what have we done lately? And Ben Bradley, not in this venue, but another one, said exuberantly at one point, the press won Watergate. That's true, but there was also that great zone of relief in the upset of removing a president, which was the system worked. And my question now is, what have we won lately? And have we made it harder for the system to work? And is that clash between politicians and the press undermining our institutions so fundamentally that their very survival is called into question? And that's the question I want to leave you with tonight. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Toki says, now what do we do?
I take directions.
Well, weren't you happy that you wrote it?
Sort of.
Well, we have 4 microphones. I think there are 2 up there, I am told. I can't see them, and there are 2 right here. It's that time when we can ask our speaker questions. If you have a question, do come to the microphones. I'll try to get to you in some kind of an order. Ask a question, don't make a speech, keep it neat, and that goes for Koki too. We'll start right here.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what you think about Mike Wallace and what he did about taping the journalist.
I must say, I'm sort of puzzled about that story. For those of you who don't know, Mike Wallace apparently had a hidden camera, which he said, the part I found most interesting about this story was the size of a shirt button. Dear God. And taped a journalist. Now, the big upset seems to be that he taped, secretly taped a journalist. What is this? I mean, we are some sort of caste that can't be taped and everybody else can? I don't understand why that is verboten and taping a businessman is fine. They secret all the time. Secret in Food Lion, it's secret all I can tell you is I find it puzzling that she was sacred and the businessman isn't. That's all I can say.
Question over here, please.
I'm Taylor Batten, a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. You said in your speech that when voters are uninformed, then really the press is to blame. And I think that is probably true to a degree, but when a majority of voters don't know the representative in their own district, and when people in Washington think that even if Foley loses, they retain the speakership.
Only 30% thought that.
Right. Well, so, I mean, with those kind of ideas, to what degree are the people to blame for just being apathetic and oblivious?
But I must say I'm not very fond of the current fashion of blame the voter. Yes, everybody has an obligation to learn certain things before they go to the polls and all of that, but it seems to me that this is a real escape from responsibility on the part of both the press and the politicians. People are busy. They're not spending all their days worrying about what politicians are doing, even though the person who is in office believes that he is the center of the universe. My view about the United States Senate is the minute they're elected, I don't know about the women, but I'm sure of this for the men. The minute they're elected, they have painted on their shaving mirrors seal of the President of the United States, just so they can get used to it. But And I don't think, I think most people have lives and that they're not worrying about this and that it's our job to tell them what's going on. And how else are they going to find out? They're supposed to go to the library and look it up? Please.
Question.
Yes, I'd like to raise a question of ethics concerning a journalist who's been accused of actively shaping the same news she was regularly reporting. Specifically, your very able colleague at NPR, who gives wonderfully clear explanations of the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, Nina Totenberg. A year or two ago, the author of a book called The Real Anita Hill charged that Totenberg was responsible for one of two major leaks that led the Senate Judiciary Committee to call Hill as a witness. He went on to argue that Hill had been less credible than Thomas. A very recent book called, I think, Strange Justice argues just the opposite. Totenberg recently gave a very favorable review of that book in an All Things Considered broadcast without mentioning her own alleged involvement in having brought about the confrontation of Hill and Thomas in the first place. Do you think that was right?
First of all, I think Nina Totenberg is the best reporter covering the Supreme Court in America today. I would just like to say that. And I also, this question of the leak was examined in depth by the United States Senate, and they could not find out where the leak came from, which is a good thing for all of us.
But he does raise a question of, do you want to address the ethics part of it, as you say?
Well, I don't see, but, she was, if...
No, the business, I think the point that he was making also toward the end had to do with...
The question is not mentioning the alleged personal involvement in the story
Well,
on one side.
First of all, I don't think that I don't see why she would have any reason to do that if, in fact, how do you do this? You say, somebody accused me of doing something I didn't do, and I don't see how you do that. And it seems to me that what you do is you just sort of put it out there. You say, here's the book, here's the other book. As I recall, I didn't hear the All Things Considered piece, I heard the Morning Edition piece. And I heard both books talked about in the Morning Edition piece. So I don't know, both there's a new one by the Real Anita Hill, whatever. There's the pro-Anita Hill, the anti-Anita Hill books that are out. I don't remember their names. And as I recall, they were both talked about on the air and given pretty much equal rate.
Okay. Question, please.
Yes, I have a question about the role of journalists in the Sunday morning talk shows as celebrities. And if you could comment, something which you may know a little bit about, if you could comment on whether you think that has an impact on the way that journalists are interacting with politicians and reporting on political events when the Sunday morning they're commenting on them.
Well, I think that what happens with those programs is that the roundtable section of them, and now they all have them, as I think, is the equivalent in my mind to the op-ed page. And that is the place where you do get more freewheeling as you do on the op-ed page. So that I see it as the difference between David Broder writing the news in the news section and writing the column in the Washington Post. And I don't see that it has any difference in your relationship with members of Congress. Your relationship, look, let me put it to you this way. It is not hard to cover Congress in terms of access. How can I put this delicately? You walk around Congress, I was saying this to a colleague today who's about to start covering Congress. You walk around Congress with a microphone, you use it as a weapon, Down boy, down boy. Access isn't a problem here, What has two legs and is attracted to light? Newt Gingrich.
I'm Lori Trevino. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. And
by the way, I have to interrupt. I've told that joke to Newt a lot. He loves it.
I watched your the Nightline broadcast the other night that you hosted with Senators Kerry and Rudman on Social Security. And while I was very happy to see that the issue is coming to the fore. I was disappointed that Senator Redmond wasn't able to answer your last question.
He was too.
Yeah, I bet he
mean,
was.
It was directed to him, and Senator Kerry jumped in,
Yeah.
and we were out of time.
Well, I wanted to know, was he able to address it off the air and what he said, and also what you think about that question? Will the Republicans will they have the political will to address means testing for Social Security? And I guess along the theme of this, how can the press really have an influence on that agenda?
I think the answer to the first question is no. You know, Social Security really is the third rail of politics. One of former Congressman Romer's colleagues in what was then called the Boll Weevils said to me one day that he was in the same room with someone who talked about cutting Social Security and got in a lot of trouble in his district. So it's not something you do lightly in any way. So I think it will be a very difficult thing to address. But I do think the press's role here is to talk about it again, to talk about where the trust fund is, what it will take, you know, what are the possible solutions for fixing it, but you know, not just sort of letting it sit there and saying it's all fine, everybody. It's not.
Question up there.
Yes. Hi.
There's a pair of legs hanging there. Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about the institutional changes that may be occurring that bring about this cynicism and negativism that you have been discussing tonight in terms of the press coverage, the superficiality, the negativism, the lack of depth of the coverage. Do you think that has something more? There's something beyond just some sort of free-floating zeitgeist of the population, or is there really an institutional change going on in the media, like increasing concentration of news sources or some other structural change that may be bringing about that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, some of this stuff is stuff, you know, we've all talked about ad nauseum about, you know, the change after Watergate in Vietnam and the trust disappearing and all that. I do think that the structural change that is occurring is the one that I talked about earlier, about the alternative sources of information. I mean, I think that is where we need to pay a lot of attention. Not that there's anything evil about them. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful that people feel that they can participate in the process. I think that the reason that voter turnout was so much higher in 1992 than it had been was that people did feel they had a connection. They could call up Larry King. And even though their chances of getting through were less than winning the lottery, they could still, you know, they had a sense of connection. And I think that's terrific. The problem with it is, as I say, I think that you combine that with the mainstream, just sort of blasé, we're so smart, you know, and all those guys are bad guys. And I think that you do get to these fundamental questions about our own republic. I don't know if there's structural changes in the mainstream press beyond the ones we all talk about. I do think that there is a sense that if you say anything good about somebody, you're a patsy in some way, that you're a panderer, that you in bed with the enemy, you know, all of those things. And that if you write something that says, as I have, for instance, after this election, where I think that the Republican takeover of the House could be a very salutary thing for the institution, people start to look at you like you're crazy.
We'll have another question from the balcony.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you real quickly, specifically about an example of, you mentioned that this sort of sense that some of our institutions are heading towards possibly being undermined, specifically the presidency. To what degree do you sense, my perception of following the coverage that Bill Clinton has received from what I'll call the mainstream press, the New York Times, the major networks, is that, let me put it this way. I used to teach history, and when I told my kids about the press, I would call it the fourth check on government, and that it clearly has a role to do that. When Bill Clinton is described in the press, it's not what he did, it's him as a person. And it seems to me like there's a sense that his credibility as a human being has been undermined. And I can't help but sense that that's partly the press is doing. What do you attribute that to?
Well, this is a separate subject. I have less concern about this. I know that a lot of other people have a lot of concern about this. I am frankly less concerned about this question of talking about president's personal life than I am about the fundamental undermining of major institutions and basically saying they don't work, they can't work, they can never work. I think that with the President of the United States, unlike any other office, that we vote for the guy. I mean, I would love to say we vote for the woman, but hey. Unlike a parliamentary system, that person is going to be there. We want that person to make the right judgments in our view, whatever our personal views of the right judgments are, in the course of the 4 years. And we can't know that by issues. We can't know, that he's going to, be for welfare reform 2 years and you're out. That's not what we vote on. We vote on sort of a sense that this is somebody who will do the right thing regardless of what comes along in those 4 years, and there are things that we have no ability to predict. I mean, suppose in 1988 we had voted on the issue of who was going to dismantle the most weapons with the Soviet Union. By the time those 4 years were over, there was no Soviet Union. And I think that we as voters want a president to be someone we trust and somebody that we can trust under all circumstances. So for President of the United States, I really do have a different standard. My view is you tell everything you know and let the voters decide. I think it's completely different for any other office because there are many other checks on 100 senators and 435 members of the House and 50 governors and all of that. I think president, you just put it out there.
But Cokie, everything that you know, as opposed to every rumor that...
Oh, no, absolutely. Evidence, 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 absolutely. I mean, we do not report rumors. I have spent a lot of time saying that to young people and not young people in the trade and having them look at me like I'm a little crazy.
Hi, I'm a first year in the college, and I'm only 18, and I have not yet experienced what it means to have a great president as a leader. And I grew up in a Democratic household, so Ron Reagan doesn't count. And I was just wondering whether, with the current relationship between the press and politicians as such it is now, can a great president arise from this so-called ash heap? Will there be a phoenix?
Well, see, I mean, you grew up in a Democratic household, so Ronald Reagan doesn't count. He does for a whole lot of people. And so I think that you've got to say that he was in the minds of the majority of Americans, somebody that they trusted and counted on, regardless of what the press said. So I would not blame this on the system.
But may I further ask the question then, will it take a great crisis for the next great president, for the next, say, FDR
well,
or...
certainly, it always did to some degree. I mean, there was always the question of men, ordinary men rising above their ordinary circumstances to take on a crisis and become extraordinary men. And I think that can continue to happen. But I also would disagree with your premise. I mean, I think that in today's world, a man or woman could be considered great regardless of the press coverage. I don't think that it's necessarily going to do everybody in. You know, it's people with character that is admired by the American people are admired by the American people.
Question?
Should the voters discover or confirm that they can't turn to the Republicans any better than they could to the Democrats, do you think before we sink into teledemocracy that there's a chance for a third party?
Yes, I think, could you all hear that? The question is third party. I think there is, but there's tremendous interest in it. I mean, you really, this year for the first time, we saw much, much higher numbers of people saying that they were interested in the third party. They didn't like either party. they're downright anti-partisan, not just apartisan. But the campaign finance laws make it very hard at the presidential level. And I think that unless you have somebody with the wealth of a Ross Perot or the credibility of a Colin Powell, I don't see it easily happening. I can see it much more easily happening below the presidential level.
Go to the balcony again. There.
Could you speak for a moment about women in Congress? Do you find that their approach or that their effect is any different compared to men? And do they seem to add any credibility to the legislative process in Washington?
I love to talk about women in Congress. I've been closely related to a woman in Congress, and it is something I am happy to talk about. The fact is, women in Congress make an incredible difference, and what they discover, regardless of who they are and what kind of campaign they waged and where they sit on the ideological spectrum, they discover that once they arrive in Washington, that they are not only the congresswoman from the 2nd District of Louisiana, just for an example, but that they are also the representative of 53% of the population. And they find that they are the people who have to carry the issues of concern of families and of women in all kinds of areas, particularly economic areas. They have to carry that water, and they do it very consciously. They meet in a caucus where they sit and they say, okay, you go on, we'll try to get you on banking, we'll try to get you on Ways and Means, which I gather is now Revenues and Treasury or something, I don't know. We'll try to get you on Energy and Commerce, we'll try, and very, very consciously try to spread the women in Congress among the various committees and subcommittees, because what happens when they are there, just by being in the room, they can make an enormous difference. My mother tells the wonderful story of when she was on the banking committee, and there was a credit bill coming up, and she just walked out and added the words to the anti-discrimination. It was anti-discrimination in lending, and she added the words, or by sex or marital status. What it had had before, of course, was race, religion, etc. And she came back in and said sweetly, I'm sure you just forgot to put these in. And, and that's how we got equal credit for women. It's still been a hard time enforcing it, but that is, in fact, there's a funny story about that as well, which is that when I bought her house, evicted my mother after 26 years, she bought an apartment downtown and was having a hard time getting her mortgage approved. And she finally called up and said, look, my income is a matter of public record. What is the problem here? And they started hemming and hawing, and she finally said, I find it passing strange that I'm having this trouble, and I feel that it is probably because I'm female and elderly. And as the author of the Equal Credit Law, I am deeply concerned about this. She got her mortgage that afternoon, but... So there is, on any issue like that, on breast cancer funding, for instance, I'll tell you just another brief funny story about that. That was an issue. It was trying to get mammograms covered by Medicare was the issue for a while. Now of late there's been a lot of attention on the question of funding for breast cancer research, but trying to get mammograms covered by Medicare. And it was first in one big budget agreement, and at first it was under catastrophic health, and then that was repealed. Then it was coming up under a budget agreement. It was just a terrible problem. There was no woman on the subcommittee on health in the Ways and Means Committee. So a woman lobbyist who was not on this issue at all, she was lobbying for major corporations, but this is the other thing that happens, is that the women who are in the hallways start lobbying on these issues as well, and we in the press write about it. And this woman went to a man on the subcommittee on health and said, I need you to take in this mammogram coverage for me. And he said, oh, I can't do that. I did the last women's thing. And he said, everybody's just going to think I'm soft on women. And she said, nah, just tell him you're a breast man. He did, it worked. So yes, they make an enormous difference. In terms of credibility in the legislative process, I think that that's overstating it.
The question was about women in the legislative process. but
Right.
It's also true that women in journalism.
But highlight
do the
those
same.
issues, yes, we do. I mean, when those issues come, look, for most of us, particularly if you cover an institution like Congress, normally what you cover is as plain as the nose on your face. You know, the bill on welfare reform is on the floor, you cover it. But there are lots of days when there's not the obvious thing to cover. And one of the reasons that I feel so passionately about diversity in the newsroom is that on those days, it's what the interest of the individuals in the newsroom are that as much as anything dictates coverage, which is why we need to have old people and young people and people of various races and people of both sexes and people who have just a variety of different interests. But it is true that when you cover a legislative body and you are female, you are more likely to cover issues of interest to women and children than if you are male. It's just simple.
Right. And another question from the top.
Yeah, you may disagree with my premise here, but
Let's hear it.
I wonder if you could comment on why it seems so difficult for the press to report on the substance of legislation versus the kind of the politics of what goes into making it. I mean, the Congress passes several hundred pieces of legislation in a year, and I think if you polled people in this room even, people couldn't name more than half a dozen that were in the media, and most of those were ones that didn't get passed to begin with. I mean, things do get done by the Congress, but very little of it gets reported
Well,
in
of
the
the
mainstream
hundreds
press.
of things that get passed, a lot of them are National Daffodil Week, so, you know, we don't really have to spend a lot of attention on that. But I agree and disagree with your premise. I think basically your premise is correct, that we tend to cover conflict. Who's up, who's down. The main thing we do is not cover it all. In television, our coverage of Congress is either scandal or it is conflict with the president. You know, the president proposes, the Congress says no, or the Congress fights with him. You know, and that is, it's always in relationship to the other institution down the avenue. And hardly anything is ever talked about the institution itself and the workings of the institution itself and all that. So I do agree with the premise, that premise. It is also true, though, that what happens is when we cover it once or even a dozen times, we think we've done it. And often people aren't paying attention at the time we cover it. So that, say, at the beginning of a political campaign, we're very likely to do a series of stories on the candidates and the environment, the candidates and defense, the candidates and women's issues, you know, that kind of stuff, what you would consider substantive stories. By the time people are paying attention to the campaign, we're in the horse race. So we are, by that time, doing the who's up, who's down, who's won, who's lost. But I do think that it is true that we do much too little of just explaining the story. I'll give you a very good example of something. The Americans with Disabilities Act. There was no conflict. The Democrats and Republicans agreed, and the White House and the Congress agreed. Because there was no conflict, it wasn't covered. And what emerged from the Senate was a truly terrible bill. And because nobody covered it. And finally, the House started paying some attention to it just because they were sort of the last ones to bat, and realized it and started fixing it. But it was the absence of coverage that had allowed it to just sort of go through without people paying enough attention to the problems inherent in the legislation. So the interest groups weren't as involved as they normally would be because they weren't as aware of it. And, you know, not all interest groups are evil. A lot of interest groups represent you. And the members weren't as aware of it. I mean, it was really an interesting example of the lack of conflict, meaning lack of coverage, meaning lack of good content. And I do think it's one of our great failings.
Question here, please.
I'm also a first year at the college. You touched briefly on the emergence of this.
You know, I want to tell you something. The weather will not stay this good.
I'm from Miami,
You
too.
know, you're going to go to a football game and all the pleats are going to be rained out of your skirt. And it will smell like wet wool for the rest of the winter. Enjoy it for the next 15 minutes.
In 3 weeks, I go home to Miami for winter
Good.
break. So. You touched on the emergence of a Ross Perot-inspired information populism, if we could call it that, the idea that with all of this computer technology, who needs the media? So I'm wondering, in light of...
Or the politicians.
Or the politicians. In light of that populism, though, do you think that the media will take on a more analytical role rather than as much a reportage role? How do you see that changing?
Well, of course, to some degree, that's already happened. And there's a lot of criticism about that. I mean, the Clinton administration, for instance, is very critical of the media for doing that. They say that, you know, that when you look at the evening news, no one tells you what happened that day, that they tell you how the president did that day. They do some sort of scorecard on the president. Now, what we would say is by the time somebody turns on the evening news, they know everything already. You
Well,
know,
the
that they-
elites know everything.
Well, that's what they would
So
say.
what's the
You're
balance
with
that
them.
we need? No, not necessarily, but I'm asking you what
No.
you think the balance is.
But
that we
I'm
need
not
between.
sure, see, I don't think that's true, that only the elites are in that position, because there is so much information out there. And it's not just computers and things that elites, quote unquote, have. It is local news. I mean, by the time you turn on the network news, you have often seen a full hour of local news. There's the car radio on the way home. There's so much information out there. In an office, any kind of office, even a factory, you now have all kinds of newsletters that come through, ticking away through the day, giving you information. So our assumption is that most people know the basic facts by the time we go on the air. Now, we still give them the basic facts, but we do try to then add to that with some analysis. There is a lot of discussion about whether that's appropriate or not. In radio, you always did it, by the way. Radio always had analysis in its spots with the news. So, you know, for those of us who started, well, actually I started in television, but who fell in love with radio, we're comfortable with it. But I do think that is one of the things that's happened. I think, though, in this other question of sort of, what did you call it? I loved the name of it. Populism, what?
Techno-populism.
Techno-populism.
Or information populism.
Information populism. That the other possibility is just to get rid of you altogether. You know, to just stop paying attention to us altogether.
Koki, I just want to make a brief sort of announcement. Some of you may think that you're smelling smoke. Let me just say, there is no fire in this building. There is nothing to be upset about. Everything is fine, except there is a fire in Inman Square, and it's a rather large fire, and some of the smoke is wafting in this direction. So when a door opens or through the vents, you may be smelling some of that. But for those of you who may be a bit nervous about it, there is nothing to be nervous about. There is no fire in the building.
Unless you live in Inman Square.
If you're in Inman Square, that's another story. If your apartment is there, you got a problem.
On the other hand, if you live in Inman Square, you might want to leave now.
Okay, we got about 10 minutes. Question right there.
Yeah. My name's Ned Reynolds, and I'm a first-year public policy student here. You've cited the Times Mirror poll figure that 71% of Americans think the press gets in the way of solving problems, and you've acknowledged that the press has to shoulder a good portion of the blame for Americans' contempt for government and the efficacy of government. But how do you think you and your colleagues in the press in Washington can do your jobs differently to turn that situation around?
It's a good question. I think that part of it is just a question of attitude, you know, is to sort of give the guy a chance. One of the things I have really noticed that's interesting is that when you ask questions for information on a program like Nightline, the viewers love it. It's your colleagues in the press who want you to be doing the getcha stuff. And it is, you know, and that's who you're sort of showing off for. And there's really not a lot of need for that. I mean, most people want to see those programs to learn something. And what they don't want to learn is that you're a tough interviewer. So that there's a lot of getting yourself out of the way in these situations. And I think that's not hard to do. It might be easier for girls than for boys. But I think that, but I also think that, I do think that we need to spend some time thinking about it and re-examining our role, which is why a forum like this is useful, because I do think that just sitting down and being forced to think about it and say, and that doesn't mean that you're going to become some goody-goody, you know. I mean, look, I'm as guilty as anybody of saying things like, the Senate deserves Oliver North. They did. But, and sometimes there are things that you know, when you're saying something, you know what you mean and other people don't. And you do need to be more careful about that. One does need to be more careful about that. But, and look, I have plenty of complaints about the institutions of government. As I say, my main one is a failure of leadership, which I think has been tremendous. But I also do think that a little, as I say, examination of conscience on our part and spending some time trying to do it a little differently would make some sense.
Question on the balcony, please.
Ms. Roberts, first, thank you for a very interesting
Thank
talk
you.
and something to think about.
Thank
Second,
you.
my question is, would you comment a little bit on the view of the media of other countries, particularly mainstream media? How do they view the American press? How well are they doing their job?
Well, I think they're terrible for the most part. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. The truth is that if, you know, anybody thinks we're bad, spend them 15 minutes abroad. You know, in most countries, most media are either government-owned or party-owned. Or if the parties are, you know, I have not lived abroad since the Soviet Union disappeared, but many news organizations were funded by the KGB. You know, I mean, there was the sense of independence, which we sometimes take overboard, doesn't exist. And there's also the whole spectrum of newspapers, I think mainly of England in this reference, that just make it up, you know, totally out of whole cloth. It's fiction. It's fun to write, you know, but I mean, when I was living in Greece and discovered that people were writing fiction for the English afternoon papers, I kept saying to them, shoot, I'll take your copy. English is my first language. And so I think that comparatively we do a much, much better job.
Question right here, please.
Hi, I'm a first year, and I wanted to ask you,
I'm thrilled with all these freshmen here. Aren't you nice people?
You talked about having gained the House and the Senate, that there may be a smoothing over of the Republicans.
A what over?
A smoothing over in the national consciousness, trying to bring back a bipartisanship between both the presidency and the Congress, possibly. But I was wondering, I come from Kansas, and I remember when Nancy Kassebaum voted against the crime bill and voted for the crime bill, and Dole voted against to vote with his party. And I also remember how Dole attacked her across the state for that. And I was wondering, considering that senators do seem to have the seal of the president on their mirror when they wake up in the morning, and particularly Senator Bob Dole, I was wondering if you think that the idea of uniting Congress, and furthermore, maybe even uniting the idea of working with the House and the Senate working with the White House, if that's going to be impeded in any way through two things. One, Bob Dole, and B, the idea of the Republican Party voting together, and therefore the party members who don't vote with the party being torn down in their own states.
Right. I don't really think I said anything about bipartisanship, because I don't expect it to happen. There are people who are very interested in it, and I think, in fact, that the voters are more interested in it. I think that if in fact you did have the people in the center and both parties working together, that would be something that the voters would be very interested in, because that's where they are. But I don't really see that happening. What I was talking about was that I think that we might see a change in attitudes internally about the institutions. Look, one of the things that's happened with divided government is that for so long the Republicans thought they owned the White House and the Democrats thought they owned the Congress, that people stopped understanding the prerogatives of the institutions, so that it became a partisan thing for Republicans to hate Congress and Democrats to protect Congress. That's terrible for the institution. You know, now I gather Mickey Edwards has been here this year, and he was one of the great defenders of Congress who was a Republican, a conservative Republican. He was one of the people who really did bring that sense of the importance of the institution closest to the people to the forefront in his party. But by and large, that was the partisan view. It was bad for both institutions. And I think that one of the good things that happened when a Democrat took the White House is Republicans started feeling less sanguine about giving that much power to the president, and Democrats started feeling a little more sanguine about it. And now with Republicans taking Congress, I think they're going to start looking again at the institution of Congress and feeling much more interested in protecting its prerogatives with a Democrat in the White House. How interested are they going to be in a line item veto when they, as a Republican Congress, have worked their will on spending bills, and it's a guy with a D after his name who gets to draw the line? Probably not tremendously interested. So I think that, you know, that was my point. My point was about the effect on the institutions. If, in fact, they fall into wildly partisan bickering, which I think is very, very likely given 1996 and how people judge Bill Clinton's strength to be at the moment, which could be completely different in 1996. I think that that will also have its effect on the institution. But it was the other question that I was talking about more rather than the question of bipartisanship.
Koki, we have time for one more question, and it goes to this gentleman.
Thank you. Many have argued that the media has been sucked into a sort of junkyard dog journalism due to economic factors, the breakdown of the mom and pop newspapers, decline in circulation numbers and whatnot, which has led in turn to voter mistrust of the media and also of lack of information. Do you have any suggestions on how we can reverse the trend of the junkyard dog media, or the junkyard dog journalistic trend, and the economic forces that seem to be pulling the media down?
Well, one thing that I think it's always a mistake to do is to think that, you know, the time we live in is different from all others. We have had plenty of junkyard dogs running around for many years, and some of them were some of the great journalists of our time or past times. So, you know, I would not say that this time is different from all others. There is tremendous concern among newspapers, I know, about people not liking them. Now, there's a danger there, which is that do you then start to pander to your advertisers or to the garden club or whatever it is in order so that everybody likes you? You know, that's not a useful way to go either. But I do, I was recently talking to somebody who was working for a small newspaper, and he had just come from some conference on small newspapers, and one of the things that they find their readers feel strongly is that there is too much conflict, and there is too much negativism, and that they don't like what they read, that they just feel like it doesn't represent what they have personally experienced when they have been at the same event. You know, they were at that school board meeting, and that's not what happened there as far as they're concerned. So that, you know, I do think that there is an attitude now of trying to fix some of these things. But I think that the fundamental question about, and people in this august institution know a lot more about this than I do, but the fundamental questions about newspaper ownership and all of that are serious questions. But I think in some ways what they've done is less of what you're talking about. I think that having, you know, big chains of newspapers and monopoly newspapers have blandified them more than having the old. We used to have great newspaper wars, you know, in a city. I remember during the '84 convention being in Dallas, I guess. Yeah, it must have been Dallas. And morning news and what's the afternoon paper? Times Herald, thank you. Were still just battling it out. And during the Republican convention, Geraldine Ferraro had her, marathon press conference. And it was great. You picked up the morning news and it said, the evil witch Geraldine Ferraro, who never paid a tax in her life, and you picked up the afternoon paper and it said Saint Geraldine, who paid more in taxes than Ronald Reagan has ever thought about in his entire career. And, there was a newspaper war, and you don't see much of that anymore. I think that monopoly has had the effect of sort of ironing out the differences because people feel this sense of responsibility that is noble but boring.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.
I just wanted to thank Cokie Roberts for sharing her insights with us, for coming up here on behalf of the Shorenstein Center and the Kennedy School. Thank you again very, very much indeed. And our conversation continues tomorrow at 9:30 in the Penthouse. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Bob. You're terrific. Thank you very much.